Section 21 of the Adventures of Gerard. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier bore himself at Waterloo. The story of the 9 Prussian horsemen. Continued. On either side of the road at this point are long stretches of rolling plain, part of it yellow with corn, and part of it rich grassland watered by the Sambre. To the south of us was a low ridge, over which was the road to France. Along this road the little group of cavalry was riding. So well had Count Stein obeyed his instructions that he had struck far to the south of us in his determination to get ahead of the Emperor. Now he was riding from the direction in which we were going, the last in which we could expect an enemy. When I caught that first glimpse of them they were still half a mile away. "Sire," I cried, "the Prussians!" They all started and stared. It was the Emperor who broke the silence. "Who says they are Prussians?" "I do, sire. I, Etienne Gerard." Unpleasant news always made the Emperor furious against the man who broke it. He railed at me now in the rasping, croaking Corsican voice which only made itself heard when he had lost his self-control. "You were always a buffoon!" he cried. "What do you mean, you numbskull, by saying that they are Prussians? How could Prussians be coming from the direction of France? You have lost any wits that you ever possessed." His words cut me like a whip, and yet we all felt towards the Emperor as an old dog does to its master. His kick is soon forgotten and forgiven. I would not argue or justify myself. At the first glance I had seen the 2 white stockings on the forelegs of the leading horse, and I knew well that Count Stein was on its back. For an instant the 9 horsemen had halted and surveyed us. Now they put spurs to their horses, and with a yell of triumph they galloped down the road. They had recognized that their prey was in their power. At that swift advance all doubt had vanished. "By heavens, sire, it is indeed the Prussians!" cried Soult. Lobau and Bertrand ran about the road like 2 frightened hens. The sergeant of chasseurs drew his sabre with a volley of curses. The coachman and the valet cried and wrung their hands. Napoleon stood with a frozen face, 1 foot on the step of the carriage, and my friends, I was magnificent. What words can I use to do justice to my own bearing at that supreme instant of my life? So coldly alert, so deadly cool, so clear in brain and ready in hand. He had called me a numbskull and a buffoon. How quick and how noble was my revenge. When his own wits failed him, it was Etienne Gerard who supplied the want. To fight was absurd. To fly was ridiculous. The Emperor was stout and weary to death. At the best he was never a good rider. How could he fly from these, the picked men of an army? The best horseman in Prussia was among them. But I was the best horseman in France. I and only I could hold my own with them. If they were on my track instead of the Emperor's, all might still be well. These were the thoughts which flashed so swiftly through my mind that in an instant I had sprung from the first idea to the final conclusion. Another instant carried me from the final conclusion to prompt and vigorous action. I rushed to the side of the Emperor, who stood petrified with the carriage between him and our enemies. "Your coat, sire! Your hat!" I cried. I dragged them off him. Never had he been so hustled in his life. In an instant I had them on and had thrust him into the carriage. The next I had sprung on to his famous white Arab and had ridden clear of the group upon the road. You have already divined my plan, but you may well ask how could I hope to pass myself off as the Emperor? My figure is as you still see it, and his was never beautiful, for he was both short and stout. But a man's height is not remarked when he is in the saddle, and for the rest one had but to sit forward on the horse and round one's back and carry oneself like a sack of flour. I wore the little cocked hat and the loose grey coat with the silver star which was known to every child from one end of Europe to the other. Beneath me was the Emperor's own famous white charger. It was complete. Already, as I rode clear, the Prussians were within 200 yards of us. I made a gesture of terror and despair with my hands, and I sprang my horse over the bank which lined the road. It was enough. A yell of exultation and of furious hatred broke from the Prussians. It was the howl of starving wolves who scent their prey. I spurred my horse over the meadowland and looked back under my arm as I rode. Oh, the glorious moment when, one after the other, I saw 8 horsemen come over the bank at my heels. Only one had stayed behind, and I heard shouting and the sounds of a struggle. I remembered my old sergeant of Chasseurs, and I was sure that number 9 would trouble us no more. The road was clear and the Emperor free to continue his journey. But now I had to think of myself. If I were overtaken, the Prussians would certainly make short work of me in their disappointment. If it were so, if I lost my life, I should still have sold it at a glorious price. But I had hopes that I might shake them off. With ordinary horsemen upon ordinary horses I should have had no difficulty in doing so, but here both steeds and riders were of the best. It was a grand creature that I rode, but it was weary with its long night's work, and the Emperor was one of those riders who do not know how to manage a horse. He had little thought for them, and a heavy hand upon their mouths. On the other hand, Stein and his men had come both far and fast. The race was a fair one. So quick had been my impulse and so rapidly had I acted upon it that I had not thought enough of my own safety. Had I done so in the first instance, I should of course have ridden straight back the way we had come, for so I should have met our own people. But I was off the road and had galloped a mile over the plain before this occurred to me. Then, when I looked back, I saw that the Prussians had spread out into a long line so as to head me off from the Charleroi road. I could not turn back, but at least I could edge toward the north. I knew that the whole face of the country was covered with our flying troops, and that sooner or later I must come upon some of them. But one thing I had forgotten, the Sambre. In my excitement I never gave it a thought until I saw it, deep and broad, gleaming in the morning sunlight. It barred my path, and the Prussians howled behind me. I galloped to the brink, but the horse refused the plunge. I spurred him, but the bank was high and the stream deep. He shrank back, trembling and snorting. The yells of triumph were louder every instant. I turned and rode for my life down the river bank. It formed a loop at this part, and I must get across somehow, for my retreat was blocked. Suddenly a thrill of hope ran through me, for I saw a house on my side of the stream and another on the farther bank. Where there are 2 such houses, it usually means that there is a ford between them. A sloping path led to the brink, and I urged my horse down it. On he went, the water up to the saddle, the foam flying right and left. He blundered once, and I thought we were lost, but he recovered, and an instant later was clattering up the farther slope. As we came out I heard the splash behind me as the first Prussian took the water. There was just the breadth of the Somme between us. I rode with my head sunk between my shoulders in Napoleon's fashion, and I did not dare to look back for fear they should see my moustache. I had turned up the collar of the grey coat so as partly to hide it. Even now, if they found out their mistake, they might turn and overtake the carriage, but when once we were on the road I could tell by the drumming of their hoofs how far distant they were, and it seemed to me that the sound grew perceptibly louder, as if they were slowly gaining upon me. We were riding now up the stony and rutted lane which led from the ford. I peeped back very cautiously from under my arm, and I perceived that my danger came from a single rider who was far ahead of his comrades. He was a Hussar, a very tiny fellow, upon a big black horse, and it was his light weight which had brought him into the foremost place. It is a place of honour, but it is also a place of danger, as he was soon to learn. I felt the holsters, but to my horror there were no pistols. There was a field glass in one, and the other was stuffed with papers. My sword had been left behind with Violette. Had I only my own weapons and my own little mare I could have played with these rascals. But I was not entirely unarmed. The Emperor's own sword hung to the saddle. It was curved and short, the hilt all crusted with gold, a thing more fitted to glitter at a review than to serve a soldier in his deadly need. I drew it such as it was, and I waited my chance. Every instant the clink and clatter of the hoofs grew nearer. I heard the panting of the horse, and the fellow shouted some threat at me. There was a turn in the lane, and as I rounded it I drew up my white Arab on his haunches. As we spun round I met the Prussian Hussar face to face. He was going too fast to stop, and his only chance was to ride me down. Had he done so he might have met his own death, but he would have injured me or my horse past all hope of escape. But the fool flinched as he saw me waiting, and flew past me on my right. I lunged over my Arab's neck and buried my toy sword in his side. It must have been the finest steel and as sharp as a razor, for I hardly felt it enter, and yet his blood was within 3 inches of the hilt. His horse galloped on, and he kept his saddle for 100 yards before he sank down, with his face on the mane, and then dived over the side of the neck on to the road. For my own part I was already at his horse's heels. A few seconds had sufficed for all that I have told. I heard the cry of rage and vengeance which rose from the Prussians as they passed their dead comrade, and I could not but smile as I wondered what they could think of the Emperor as a horseman and a swordsman. I glanced back cautiously as before, and I saw that none of the 7 men stopped. The fate of their comrade was nothing compared to the carrying out of their mission. They were as untiring and as remorseless as bloodhounds. But I had a good lead, and the brave Arab was still going well. I thought that I was safe, and yet it was at that very instant that the most terrible danger befell me. The lane divided, and I took the smaller of the 2 divisions because it was the more grassy and the easier for the horse's hoofs. Imagine my horror when, riding through a gate, I found myself in a square of stables and farm buildings, with no way out save that by which I had come. Ah, my friends, if my hair is snowy white, have I not had enough to make it so? To retreat was impossible. I could hear the thunder of the Prussians' hoofs in the lane. I looked round me, and nature has blessed me with that quick eye which is the first of gifts to any soldier, but most of all to a leader of cavalry. Between a long, low line of stables and the farmhouse there was a pigsty. Its front was made of bars of wood 4 feet high. The back was of stone, higher than the front. What was beyond I could not tell. The space between the front and the back was not more than a few yards. It was a desperate venture, and yet I must take it. Every instant the beating of those hurrying hoofs was louder and louder. I put my Arab at the pigsty. She cleared the front beautifully and came down with her 4 feet upon the sleeping pig within, slipping forward upon her knees. I was thrown over the wall beyond and fell upon my hands and face in the soft flower bed. My horse was upon one side of the wall, I upon the other, and the Prussians were pouring into the yard. But I was up in an instant and had seized the bridle of the plunging horse over the top of the wall. It was built of loose stones, and I dragged down a few of them to make a gap. As I tugged at the bridle and shouted, the gallant creature rose to the leap, and an instant afterward she was by my side and I with my foot on the stirrup. An heroic idea had entered my mind as I mounted into the saddle. These Prussians, if they came over the pigsty, could only come one at once, and their attack would not be formidable when they had not had time to recover from such a leap. Why should I not wait and kill them one by one as they came over? It was a glorious thought. They would learn that Etienne Gerard was not a safe man to hunt. My hand felt for my sword, but you can imagine my feelings, my friends, when I came upon an empty scabbard. It had been shaken out when the horse had tripped over that infernal pig. On what absurd trifles do our destinies hang! A pig on one side, Etienne Gerard on the other. Could I spring over the wall and get the sword? Impossible. The Prussians were already in the yard. I turned my Arab and resumed my flight. But for a moment it seemed to me that I was in a far worse trap than before. I found myself in the garden of the farmhouse, an orchard in the centre, and flower beds all round. A high wall surrounded the whole place. I reflected, however, that there must be some point of entrance, since every visitor could not be expected to spring over the pigsty. I rode round the wall. As I expected, I came upon a door with a key upon the inner side. I dismounted, unlocked it, opened it, and there was a Prussian lancer sitting his horse within 6 feet of me. End of section 21.